The perfume was my only treasure, but that night, it became so much more. Each drop of nard that flowed out carried a deeper truth than I could comprehend at the time. True love demands sacrifice. Yet what I didn't know was that as I gave all I had, something greater was unfolding. Something that would change history forever. The alabaster jar rested before me, lying on a simple linen cloth at the center of my small table. I looked at it as if for the first time, though it had been with me for years. Its white, smooth surface reflected the light of the late afternoon sun streaming through the window of my home. Inside, the pure nard perfume awaited. It was the only item of value I possessed, but it seemed to carry much more than just a price tag. The rumors had reached the village early that day. Jesus was in Bethany, staying at the house of Simon, the healed leper. People spoke excitedly, "He's resting before the Passover." But I knew that with Jesus, it was never just that. Every place he visited seemed to be transformed. And now, he was so close. I sat down slowly, my restless hands resting in my lap. There was something I wanted to express, but it felt impossible to put into words. Gratitude? Love? Worship? It was all of those things and more. But how could I, a woman so imperfect, offer anything to him? The jar seemed to pulse before me, as if waiting to be chosen. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. My mind began to whisper against me, "You're not worthy to enter that house. They will judge you. Even Jesus might disapprove." With every thought, my courage faltered. But then I remembered him. The look he gave me once when he saw me in the crowd. There was something in his expression that seemed to see beyond everything, beyond my mistakes, beyond the judgments I carried. He looked at me as if I had worth. And in that gaze, I found the strength I needed. I opened my eyes, and the jar was still there, motionless, waiting. I reached out and held it carefully, as though it were sacred. My mind still wrestled with the decision. It's wasteful. It's irrational. You will be humiliated. But my heart answered, he is worthy of everything. I stood with the jar firm in my hands. I stepped outside as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. The walk to Simon's house would be short, but each step felt like a battle against the voice that insisted on holding me back. The street seemed longer that night. The simple houses of Bethany, with their stone walls and thatched roofs, stood silently, like witnesses to my journey. I held the alabaster jar tightly against my chest, feeling the weight not just of the object, but of the decision I had made. As I walked, the world around me echoed with memories. I remembered the times I had been judged, rejected, treated as if I had no worth. The words and glances of condemnation were still vivid in my mind, as if they had happened yesterday. My instinct was to turn back, to hide, but the thought of Jesus pushed me forward. I paused for a moment at the entrance to the main street, taking a deep breath. Simon's house was just ahead, illuminated by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on its stone walls. The sound of male voices, interspersed with laughter and lively discussions, drifted through the open door. It was a strange contrast to the weight of seriousness I carried within me. My heart raced as I caught sight of Jesus seated at the table. He was speaking with Simon, his demeanor calm, almost transcendent. While the others in the room seemed engrossed in their own concerns and debates, he was present in a way that defied explanation. And then, as if he knew I was there, he looked directly at me. His gaze froze me in place. It wasn't one of surprise or judgment, but of recognition. He knew I would come. In that moment, all the noise around me seemed to fade away. It was as if the world had stopped, leaving only him and me. But then, the murmurs began. The room was full of men, Simon, Jesus' disciples, and other guests. Now, all eyes were on me. I could feel their expressions of surprise, confusion, and in some cases, reproach. Simon, seated beside Jesus, furrowed his brow. His expression seemed to ask, "What is she doing here?" For a moment, I stood motionless. The weight of their gazes was overwhelming. I thought about turning and fleeing, but Jesus' eyes were still fixed on mine. There was something in them that urged me to go on. He saw me. He knew. I took one step forward, then another, each movement more difficult than the last. When I finally reached him, I fell to my knees, clutching the jar as if it were my very heart. The murmurs ceased, replaced by a silence that seemed alive. The tension in the room was palpable, but all I could see was him. I placed the jar on the ground, my hands trembling. My heart told me it was the moment, but doubt still whispered in my mind. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and with a firm motion, prepared for what was to come. I knelt before him, feeling the weight of the alabaster jar in my hands as if it contained all my doubts, fears, and hopes. The silence in the room was deafening, every gaze fixed on me, every breath suspended. The tension in the air felt like an invisible burden, yet at the same time, there was something sacred about the moment. Something that transcended discomfort and judgment. Jesus continued to look at me, and in his eyes, there was an acceptance so complete it dismantled every resistance within me. There was no reproach, only a silent invitation. I knew he understood what I was about to do, even without my saying a word. I took a deep breath and lifted the jar. My fingers trembled, but my heart began to find courage amidst the chaos. With a decisive motion, I broke the alabaster jar against the floor beside me. The sound of the jar shattering was sharp, echoing through the room like thunder, slicing through the silence. The nard perfume, sweet and overwhelming, escaped immediately, flooding the space. It was an aroma so intense it seemed alive, wrapping everyone in the room in an undeniable presence. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the perfume speak what my words could not express. Carefully, I poured the nard onto Jesus' feet. The golden liquid flowed gently, covering his feet and pooling onto the floor. My tears began to fall, mingling with the perfume in an act of complete surrender. I took my hair and began to dry his feet, feeling the texture of the perfume and my tears combined. It was my gift, my worship, my soul poured out before him. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. There were no more murmurs, only the sound of my heart beating and the persistent aroma of the nard. But then, the first voice broke the silence. What a waste! Judas's sharp voice echoed through the room, pulling me out of that sacred moment. I looked up, still kneeling, and saw his face twisted with indignation. He was leaning forward, pointing at the shattered pieces of the alabaster jar on the floor. This perfume could have been sold for 300 silver coins and the money given to the poor. His eyes, filled with judgment, weren't fixed solely on me. It felt as though he was challenging everyone in the room. A few heads nodded in agreement. Peter and Matthew exchanged uncertain glances, while others began to murmur amongst themselves. Judas's outrage was like a stone cast into a pond, creating ripples of doubt and discomfort. My heart sank. Could he be right? Had I truly wasted what was most precious to me? The tears that had once been an expression of surrender now threatened to turn into tears of shame. I couldn't lift my gaze, fearing more reproach in the faces around me. Isn't this what he taught us? Judas continued, his voice gaining strength. To help those in need, the poor. Wouldn't that be more important than a gesture like this? I had no answer to give. There was no way to justify what I had done. All I knew, deep in my heart, was that it was right. But in that moment, it felt like no one else understood. I felt small, crushed under the weight of judgment. And then Jesus spoke. Leave her alone. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried an authority that silenced the room instantly. All murmurs ceased, and every gaze turned to him. Judas took a slight step back, surprised by the intervention. I, too, lifted my eyes, meeting his once again. She has done something beautiful for me, Jesus continued, his voice firm but filled with tenderness. He looked directly at Judas, and then at the others in the room. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. He paused, letting his words resonate in the heavy silence. She has done what she could. She poured this perfume on my body to prepare me for burial. The words "to prepare me for burial" hung in the air, laden with a meaning that few seemed to grasp. Peter leaned forward, his brow furrowed, as though trying to decipher what Jesus meant. John, on the other hand, lowered his head, his eyes filled with a quiet sadness. Jesus turned his gaze back to me, and his expression softened even further. Truly, I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. My heart, which had been so heavy moments before, now felt as light as a feather. His words dispelled every doubt, every trace of shame. He had seen my heart, and that was all that mattered. The human judgment surrounding me became insignificant in the light of his acceptance. As the room began to stir again, Judas remained motionless, his eyes fixed on a spot on the floor. His expression was closed, burdened with something I couldn't understand. Finally, he stood abruptly, pushing his chair back, and left the room. The sound of his footsteps echoed, leaving a trail of unease in his wake. I watched him leave, my heart tightening. There was something final in his departure, as though he had made a decision no one there could foresee. But in that moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was that he had accepted my gesture. The perfume still lingered in the air, so strong and sweet it seemed to have fused with the very atmosphere of the room. Yet its fragrance couldn't mask the tension now enveloping the space. Judas was gone, and his departure had left a palpable unease among the disciples. No one knew quite what to think or say. Simon, the host, cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable with the prolonged silence. He glanced at the shards of the broken jar on the floor, then hesitantly turned his gaze to Jesus. "Master, I do not question your words, but couldn't there have been a better way to use this perfume? Something that could have helped more people?" His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a host trying to balance hospitality with his own doubts. Jesus looked at Simon, his gaze serene yet intense. "Simon, you welcomed me into your home, but she welcomed me with what was most precious to her. You offered me food, but she anointed my body for something far greater. Who, then, truly understands what it means to give?" Jesus' words lingered in the air like a question demanding reflection. Simon averted his gaze, clearly unsettled, and fell silent. Around the table, the other disciples appeared even more confused. Peter, unable to contain his restlessness, leaned forward. "Master, what did you mean by burial? Aren't we here to celebrate Passover? Why speak of this now?" Peter's question was direct, almost challenging, as was often his way. Jesus turned to him, his eyes carrying a sadness that seemed beyond human comprehension. "There are things you do not yet understand, Peter. But when the time comes, you will remember this moment. And then, you will understand." Peter leaned back slowly, clearly uncomfortable with the response. John, seated near him, lowered his head, his eyes fixed on the table. There was something in his expression that suggested he was beginning to grasp the meaning of Jesus' words, though the weight of them was too much to voice aloud. As the others slowly resumed their conversations, I remained kneeling on the floor, gazing at the pieces of the jar beside me. They glimmered in the lamplight, fragments of something that, even in its brokenness, still held value. I felt small, yet at peace. He had accepted my offering, and that was enough. As the evening progressed, Judas's absence became impossible to ignore. A few of the disciples began whispering amongst themselves, trying to make sense of his abrupt departure. Matthew, ever pragmatic, attempted to justify it. "He must be frustrated. We've worked so hard to help others, and this was unexpected." Peter shook his head, clearly uneasy. "It's not just frustration. There's something else." He seemed different. He looked at John, as though seeking confirmation, but John remained silent, his expression serious. Across the table, Simon observed everything quietly. His eyes shifted between the disciples but occasionally returned to Jesus. It was evident he, too, felt the weight of the situation, yet as the host, he hesitated to speak again. Finally, Jesus broke the silence. "Not all who are with me understand what is happening. Not all who share bread with me comprehend what is to come." His words were calm but carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. He looked at the disciples, then turned his gaze to me. "But you, Mary, have understood what others cannot see. You have done something eternal tonight." His voice softened as he said this, and I felt tears well up in my eyes again. His words didn't just dispel any lingering doubt I had, they also brought a sense of purpose I hadn't realized I needed. Silence settled over the room once more, but it was a different kind of silence. It was no longer the discomfort that had filled the space earlier, but a sense of reverence, as though everyone now realized they were witnessing something far greater than they could comprehend. Later, as the meal continued, I stayed where I was, observing and reflecting. Judas had not returned, and a quiet unease lingered in the air, though no one seemed willing to address it. The disciples were divided between continuing their conversations and contemplating what Jesus had said. Simon attempted to normalize the atmosphere by offering more food and wine, but even he appeared distracted. When the night finally ended, I rose slowly, still sensing the nard perfume lingering in my hands and hair. The shattered jar remained on the floor, untouched. It was more than just broken fragments. It was a symbol of what had been offered and what was yet to come. As I left Simon's house, I looked at Jesus one last time. He was surrounded by his disciples, but his eyes seemed distant, as if he were seeing something beyond all of us. He said nothing, but there was a peace in his expression that contradicted the weight he so clearly carried. Walking back home, the aroma of the perfume clung to me, a constant reminder. He had accepted my gesture, but I knew that what was to come was greater than anything any of us could imagine. As I walked beneath the starlit sky, the nard's fragrance felt like an unshakable presence on my skin. It was comforting, yet unsettling. The gesture felt larger than myself, larger than anything I could comprehend. He had accepted my offering, but his words still echoed in my mind. She has prepared me for burial. The silence of Bethany's streets contrasted sharply with the storm within me. I couldn't shake the image of Judas leaving the house, his expression burdened with something dark and final. There had been a struggle in his eyes, something no one else seemed to notice. Why had he reacted that way? What did his departure mean? When I finally reached my home, the faint light of an oil lamp illuminated the simple space I called my own. I placed the cloth on the table and sat, gazing at my hands, still faintly glistening from the perfume's oil. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, letting myself feel the peace that night had brought, despite all its tensions. Lord, I began to pray, my voice a whisper, thank you. I don't understand everything that happened, but I know you saw my heart. Thank you for accepting my offering, for giving me the courage to be there. Help me to understand what is to come. As I prayed, a wave of gratitude washed over me. I didn't fully grasp the meaning of Jesus' words about burial, but I trusted that he did. He always knew. I fell asleep with the perfume still lingering around me, a constant reminder that something extraordinary had taken place. Yet, there was also a restlessness within me, a sense that this night was only the beginning of something far greater. The days that followed were calm, yet the air felt different. The people of Bethany spoke excitedly about Jesus, recalling his words, his miracles, and his teachings. Yet amidst the rumors, there was an undertone of concern. Some mentioned the religious leaders in Jerusalem, whispering about their intentions. Others spoke of his triumphant entry into the city, as if anticipating something monumental was about to unfold. I continued with my routine, but every movement seemed accompanied by reflections on that night. Jesus' words replayed in my mind constantly, especially when he said, "Wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." It was hard to fathom how something so simple, so intimate, could have such an eternal impact. The people who learned about my gesture reacted in various ways. Some looked at me with curiosity, while others seemed to avoid my eyes, as if unsure how to process what they'd heard. One elderly woman, who lived near my home, stopped me one afternoon. "I heard what you did," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "You gave what was most precious to you for him. It gave me courage." Her words took me by surprise, and for a moment, I couldn't respond. I simply held her hands and smiled, realizing that, even without fully understanding, my gesture had touched something beyond what I had imagined. That evening, as I prayed again, something became clear in my mind. The perfume, the broken jar, Jesus' words, all of it was connected to what was to come. My act wasn't just a gift. It was a reflection of the sacrifice he would make, something that would transcend that moment and become part of a much greater story. As I lay down, I felt a deep peace mixed with a quiet melancholy. The nard's scent had faded from my skin, but it remained with me, imprinted in my memory and spirit. I knew the days ahead would bring challenges no one could foresee, but I also knew somehow that my heart was ready. If this story moved you, imagine the wisdom and inspiration waiting in The Virtues of Women in the Bible, Timeless Lessons from Modern Life. Dive deeper into the lives of Hannah, Esther, Abigail, Ruth, and Mary, and discover how their virtues of faith, love, and perseverance can guide you through your own challenges. Scan the QR code on the screen or click the pinned comment to access this life-changing ebook. Let these extraordinary women inspire your journey to a future filled with purpose, courage, and joy.